Good day. For my next video, I'd like to dive into the issue of the status of Crimea. It is central to understanding the nature of Ukrainian strategic goals. On one side of the legal spectrum, Crimea is officially recognized as part of Ukraine by the United Nations, European Union, the United States. In fact, only North Korea currently recognizes Russian annexation of Crimea, something rarely acknowledged in Western media. This widespread legal recognition is firmly rooted in international law and is buttressed by previous agreements that unequivocally affirm Ukraine's territorial integrity. However, on the opposite side of the spectrum, the situation on the ground tells a vastly different story. Since the transformative events of 2014, Russia has unilaterally controlled and administered Crimea, following what most consider to be a disputed and contentious military intervention coupled with a non-legally binding referendum. A referendum that not even China recognizes. Gaining an understanding of this dichotomy between legal recognition and tangible control is crucial for grasping the persistent tensions that characterize the region today. So, to set the stage and for some context, let's just take a brief look at the history of Crimea itself. Recorded history in Crimea goes back to 1000 BCE with early settlements by the Scythians. In the 7th century BCE, Greek colonies were founded there. In the 1st century BCE, Crimea fell under Roman control as part of the Bosporan Kingdom, a client state. Through the medieval period, Crimea was controlled by various empires including the Byzantine Empire, Goths, and Huns. Later the Khazars, a Turkic people, dominated the region. Over the centuries, Crimea also passed between Kievan Rus, the Mongol Golden Horde, and the Ottoman Empire, always remaining a coveted prize. In 1783, the Russian Empire annexed Crimea under Catherine the Great. Between 1853 and 1856, the Crimean War was fought by Russia against Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire, resulting in a Russian defeat. The Black Sea was neutralized, meaning Russia was prohibited from maintaining warships or naval fortifications there. Russia was compelled to cede territory to the Ottoman Empire, although Crimea remained under Russian control. In 1921, Crimea becomes the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic within Soviet Russia. In 1944, Stalin deported Crimean Tatars en masse, accusing them of Nazi collaboration. In 1954, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev transfers Crimea from Russia to Ukraine, both part of USSR, as a goodwill gesture. In 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, Crimea became an autonomous republic within the independent nation of Ukraine. Sevastopol was granted special status due to Russian Black Sea Fleet presence under lease agreements. Russian-Ukrainian tensions continue to simmer over the naval base and ethnic Russian population. In late February 2014, Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, fled Kiev after months of the now famous Euromaidan protests. Yanukovych was impeached in an unanimous vote, and a new government under Alexander Turchinov, newly appointed chairman of the Ukrainian Rada, was named until new elections could be held later in May of that year. Russia, however, condemned the change in power, calling it a coup. Soon, with almost no public discussion from Russia, unmarked troops dubbed Little Green Men seized the Crimean parliament and key infrastructure, as well as parts of the Donbass. They were later confirmed to be Russian special forces. Suddenly, under direct military occupation, Crimea's regional parliament ousted the Crimean prime minister and installed Sergei Aksionov, a pro-Russian figure. Russian forces secured airports, media, and military bases across Crimea. Russian parliament officially authorized use of force in Ukraine, but no votes were held in the United Nations. In March, still under Russian military occupation, Crimea's parliament voted to join Russia and scheduled a referendum, with no outside observers present. Officially, Russia claimed 97% of Crimea voted to join Russia, but this was universally rejected internationally. In late March, President Vladimir Putin signed a treaty of accession, formally annexing Crimea into the Russian Federation, and Ukraine's military was ordered to withdraw from Crimea. In response, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 68-262 on the 27th of March, 2014, which emphatically affirmed Ukraine's territorial boundaries and declared the referendum invalid and void. The United States, European Union, and allies also imposed historically significant sanctions on Russia, which visibly hurt Russia's economy. The justification that Russia used for the invasion and annexation was the claimed protection of ethnic Russians and historical ties to Crimea. However, quite to the contrary, there were reports of the persecution of Crimean Tatars, journalists, and pro-Ukrainian activists. Russia claimed to be protecting the Russian-speaking population, but as discussed in my previous video, this justification does not comport with previous efforts to protect civilians such as in the NATO-led intervention in the Kosovo War. Russia's justification to annex Crimea lacks sufficient evidence, sufficient consensus, and historical consistency. Especially given how many Russian speakers are dying currently. These watershed events in Crimea are pivotal in unraveling the current status of the war in Ukraine, the ongoing geopolitical situation, and has widespread implications for the future. During these transformative events, Russia engaged in a military intervention that culminated in a controversial referendum conducted under a significant military presence which completely delegitimized its outcome. Numerous nations and a host of international bodies vocally criticized the referendum, denouncing it as both illegitimate and coercive. As noted, Russia's senior partner and largest backer, China, also does not recognize this annexation or the referendum held. As such, Russian justification for this invasion and annexation is patently illegal and unrecognized. The international community's firm stance against any alterations to borders achieved through military force and coercion needs to set a precedent for future geopolitical issues. Ukraine, of course, never accepted Russia's actions in Crimea as anything but a flagrant breach of international law, with particular emphasis on the Budapest Memorandum. This agreement was crafted specifically with the intent to safeguard Ukraine's sovereignty in return for its strategic denuclearization. Russia's violation of these accords brings to light profound and widespread concerns about global security and the integrity of established international treaties. Despite Russia's flagrant aggression, Ukraine continued to negotiate under the Steinmeier Formula and the Minsk I agreements. To quote from President Volodymyr Zelensky's October 4 video address to Ukrainians themselves, he said of the Steinmeier Formula, "Does it imply that Ukraine recognizes the annexation of Crimea and renounces Donbass? No. Does it imply that elections in Donbass will be held tomorrow at the barrel of machine guns? No. This formula means only one thing: when the so-called law on the special status of Donbass should start working. Namely, after the local elections there, which will be held under the Constitution of Ukraine, the legislation of Ukraine, and after the publication of the OSCE report that the elections were held in accordance with international democratic standards." End quote. The Steinmeier Formula was named after former German Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier. In 2016, Steinmeier proposed that elections be held in the Russian-held territories in Ukraine. This formula was created to uphold the Minsk agreements, which were formally adopted by the Trilateral Contact Group on Ukraine, consisting of Ukraine, Russia, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. Minsk I was signed on September 5, 2014, but broke down after Russia sent in additional troops to Ukraine, seizing control of the Donetsk International Airport. Minsk II was signed on February 12, 2015, but ultimately failed to produce the key development that Russia withdraw their military forces from Ukraine, and as such no election could be attempted. Acknowledging and studying these laws and agreements give invaluable insight into the international community's responsibility in the ongoing diplomatic tensions surrounding Crimea. Tensions that have far-reaching implications for the global balance of power and diplomatic relations. In conclusion, while the legal and international community broadly recognizes Crimea as an integral part of Ukraine, the facts on the ground paint a different picture. In practice, Russia has maintained control over the region since its annexation in 2014. This stark dichotomy between legal frameworks and real-world control presents a significant and enduring challenge for diplomacy and the enforcement of international law. The world must recognize this and stand firm. Crimea is Ukrainian, as are all of the occupied territories. Some in the media like to note that Russia annexed Crimea, but it should always be noted that this annexation was illegal and not recognized outside of Russia. Today, Ukraine continues to exercise a degree of air and sea superiority over Crimea as Russia's Black Sea Fleet has been forced to withdraw from Sevastopol, Crimea to Novorossiysk within Russia, and Ukraine continues to strike Russian airfields with drones and missiles. Russia has fortified their airfields and continues to be deployed there, but operations are limited. Ukrainian partisan activity is also ongoing in Crimea, with groups like Atesh hitting railways, power infrastructure, radars, as well as fuel and ammunition depots. The issue of control of Crimea is not going away. Under international law, Crimea is Ukrainian, so any legal change to this status would need to be resolved in future negotiations. Given the de jure status of Crimea is Ukrainian and the de facto status of Russian strategic control of Crimea remains limited, it would seem a good time to reaffirm Ukrainian commitment to its territory and its people, and for Ukraine's allies to declare themselves in this regard. This situation continues to serve as a focal point for discussions on sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the complex power dynamics that underlie contemporary international relations. The interplay between legal principles and geopolitical realities remains a crucial subject for analysis and understanding within global policymaking circles and will remain so for years. So thank you so much for watching. If you'd please, hit the subscribe and like buttons. It's free and would really help me to grow. It also helps the algorithm get more Russia-Ukraine war content. All comments are welcome, including any suggestions you have regarding the tone or style of my videos. I'm looking at different voices or recording myself, so welcome any feedback in this regard. Thank you again. As always, glory to the Ukrainian heroes.